I think today we're going to start. I'm going to give everyone a chance to speak for a few moments. We really want to maximize Q&A time, so we'll move into that pretty quickly. And then we'll finish, give everyone a chance to make a closing statement or so, and then also especially to talk about what we can do today. So I will start with Nili, if you want to talk a little bit about this work, how you came to this work, what this film means to you. I'll just give you a few minutes to do that.
Thank you for everybody coming and joining this screening. Guests, family, also including my friends who drove this morning from Toronto, they are here. Yes, 8 hours. Uri and Adi, and thank you, my partners here. This film, as you saw, was a long period. And almost every time I was filming, it was like an alarm. It's going to be now so-and-so, so as I had to run with the camera. It was very sporadic along this long period. There were emotional scenes, not only what you see on the screen, also experiencing it while looking at those people and being with them through the process they went through. And that was for 3 years. I'll tell a bit about the film. 3 years and a half I was running by myself with my producer, Sasha Klein, loyal producer, and Karen Alon, the editor. And we started following the events, not knowing where it's going to lead us to. Then it was independence of South Sudan, then throwing them out of the country. So we were waiting to see what the news are going to be, what's going to be next. And I'm very happy that we can be a voice, to represent a voice that is not really heard, especially the women. All what we saw in the television, in the media, were items, were fights in the streets. I mean, things that you saw just a little bit of it in the film. Maybe not a little bit, but you got the impression, the attitude from the government, from leaders, which was very, very upsetting for a big part of population in Israel. Not even, it looks like everybody's against, but it's not true. Many people do identify with those people because I'm an immigrant as well. I was born in Romania, and I'm sure all my friends in Israel, parents came from different countries. So I'm in a country that is a country of immigrants, who was built for immigrants, and we must think twice before we do something against other people looking for asylum. I'll give my microphone to my colleagues here, and later on you'll be able to ask questions, but first, it's your...
Thank you, Nili. Elliot, do you want to talk a little bit about your work and what brings you to it?
Sure. Sure, I'll say a few words. First of all, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks. I'm so glad that the Vaisrub Film Festival brought this film, and it's amazing that Nili came all the way from Israel. So I also just want to say, I want to note that we don't have any refugees sitting on this panel. We tried to get somebody who is a refugee who had been in Israel and is now in America to be here to sound their voice, but there are very few who have managed to make it from Israel to America, as you could see in the film, because of the various legal conundrums. It's very difficult, so we weren't able to find someone to be here. So I'm here with a couple of hats. One is my day job, which is I work for BINA, the Jewish Movement for Social Change, which is an Israeli social change NGO that does Jewish education and social action in Israel. And one of the things that we're trying to do is trying to redefine for the next generation what it means to be a Jewish state, and for us, the state of Jewish values, not just a state for Jews only. And through BINA, I started doing volunteer work with African asylum seekers in South Tel Aviv when I made Aliyah several years ago. So I worked as a Hebrew and English teacher for asylum seekers, and through that I got involved with this broader world of activism. I guess a nice Jewish boy from Chicago made Aliyah and became a refugee activist. My mother's very proud. Nice Jewish mother, yeah. She raised me well. She can only blame herself. And so I got involved with, so I've been involved with a lot of different of the NGOs working in Israel, beyond BINA, the hotline for refugees and migrants that Asaf can speak about, and just a group of independent Israeli volunteers and activists that have been organizing buses to visit the Cholot detention centers, to help people get access to health services if they need, to support emotional support, and to raise awareness about the issue in Israel. And I've become involved in, right now, Advocates for Asylum Seekers in Israel, which is a network of volunteers, pretty much North American, Canadian, and Jewish volunteers who have spent time in Israel, went to Israel, volunteered in Israel, got to know the refugee community, and came back to America and Canada and said, how come nobody knows about this? How come nobody's talking about this? Including involved active Jews that are following the news from Israel who don't know about this issue, with the hope that if people knew about this, they would do something, they would say something. They wouldn't let refugees be deported and being treated the way they are. So we're trying to raise awareness on this side of the ocean. I'm back on this side of the ocean for a couple of years to do work and also to raise attention to this issue. So thanks.
Thanks, Elliot. Asaf, do you want to talk a little bit about your work and how you came to it?
Hi, so thank you for coming, and thanks, Nili, for this touching movie. For the last 5-6 years, I ran the legal department at the Hotline for Refugees and Migrants. You saw Sigal, one of the characters in the film. She works with me, she was my colleague. And the organization was established in 1998 by a group of Israeli citizens that were concerned about the human rights violations, or the violation of rights of migrant workers. And through that, and since the end of 2005, we discovered the issue of asylum seekers and refugees in Israel, and put a lot of resources in trying to promote their rights, mainly regarding their legal status in Israel and being released from detention, both through policy and advocacy and policy change, and through going with particular cases to the courts and eventually to the Supreme Court, trying to make a change. I can say that in the end of 2012, I guess we'll reach again to this from another direction, but in the end of 2012, we had 65,000 asylum seekers in Israel, mostly from Eritrea and Sudan, two countries Israel never tried to deport to, and never deported to. But at the same time, we had almost 0% recognition rate of people as refugees. And many of them were detained, and even when they were released from detention, they would be sent again to detention. And I, after graduating law school, I went, and actually I was a commercial lawyer for 2.5 years, 3 years, and I understood, and I saw the situation, I saw it on the news, I knew it from friends, and decided to make a change and work in this field. So I've done it for almost 6 years, and recently I decided I cannot do it anymore. It just breaks my heart.
Thank you so much. We'll now open for questions from the audience. And what I'd like to do is, well, first of all, I'll say I please ask you to ask a question, not to give a speech. And I will jump in if I feel like you're not getting to a question. And then also, I'm going to take a couple questions at once, and then I'll have the panelists decide which ones they want to address. So.
Yeah, I was a little confused about the status of the children because I saw them studying in Israeli schools. So I'm saying, what's happening with the children whose parents are refugees and might be sent back or whatever?
So we have one question about the children. I'm going to take a couple more, and then.
2 questions. First, how do you try to change basic Israeli attitudes about refugee rights? I mean, my family in Israel can be as liberal as they come for all other purposes except this. And the racist rhetoric that I hear is just, mind-boggling. My second question is, why did the movie not address some of the victories that took place in this sphere in the last few years, especially in the Israeli Supreme Court, which I should mention now gives more rights with regard to the length of detention than most of the U.S. courts with regard to how long the detention can be for refugees.
Maybe one more, and then we'll have a question.
Just backing up from that first question that the previous questioner asked, for those of us that are not as familiar with this as we might want to be, I'd like to hear from the panel about what are the roots of this Israeli attitude? Because I have to say, as somebody who has not been versed in this, and like Nili, a first-generation American son of a refugee and Jewish, I have to say I was completely taken aback by what I was watching. And, we're coming up on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, and to reflect on that is shocking. And I think the other question is good, but for some of us, I think we'd like to hear a little bit about what the roots of this are.
Okay, great. So we have a question about children, about how to change attitudes, where the attitudes are coming from, and then interest in hearing about some victories. So who would like to start? Nili?
It's my field.
Great.
Now it's not only 106 children, it's 130. And they are supported by NGOs, of course, because, as you see in the film, nothing from the government, no help.
Talking about the children and
Somebody asked me last night in Harlem if the kids are, who taught them Hebrew in Uganda. I said, they are Israelis. We call them Israelis because they came from Israel. They were raised there like 8 years or so, studied in Israeli schools. They speak Hebrew better than some of you here, yes? And there is an organization that it's called Become, Come True of Become. And they support all the children that you've seen in the film in this specific school, Trinity. It's a boarding school. They pay like $100 for each kid for every year at school for their food, clothes, books. And all is done in order to maintain from them what their parents are going through, instead of being spread in the villages with no future, with no possibility of continuing to study anything and to be somebody that can stay on his own and fight for himself and be a person with a profession in life, can help his brothers and his own people. That was the reason it was created, and this is an amazing thing that hold those people, those kids in Uganda. They are depending on this kind of help. For every other kids that wants to join this school, they have to look for somebody who will be ready to give a yearly support for the kids. The second question you asked about, and then I'll pass it to you guys, about where it's coming from. The fear in Israel, in the government, is demographic fear. So they are scared that it will change from Jewish country, it will become a country which is not majority of Jewish people. And that's what leads. And I think there is a big moral conflict here, because it's against what happened with us, that we came to Israel and all what happened after the war, that everybody came to Israel, escaped to Israel. And this is, I think, the main thing that is scaring. They're not taking work from other people. Israel keep bringing plenty of tens of thousands of workers from Turkey, used to be from Turkey, from Thailand, from China, and they try to deport the people from Africa. It was easier to keep them here until there is a solution, until they can go back to their country, will be safe, and teach them to work in agriculture, spread them around the country, and not to be only in Tel Aviv and in Eilat, in big communities. And I think this is the main thing that my friends will add to it.
Well, maybe just a comment about the kids. If you were talking about the rights of the kids in Israel, then basically they have almost none. They have the same status of their parents, which is a no status. It's a conditional release visa, the visa we saw in the movie. It says specifically that it's not a working permit, although only with this you can work to some extent, because there are no sanctions on your employer. But the kids, you have to send them to school, okay? And the schools accept them in most of the cities. There are cities that we have issues with it, but basically they're accepted. In Eilat, they try to send them outside of the city to a different school just for infiltrator kids. This is how they are called, infiltrator kids. And they have no rights, not by birth, not by staying for 10 years in Israel, not by staying 20 years in Israel. So this is the situation with the kids. And regarding the roots of the issue, while I concur, I agree with Nili. I think I have another maybe angle to this, because look at the facts. We have 66 million asylum seekers and displaced people all over the world. It's the biggest humanitarian and refugee and migration crisis since the Second World War. In Israel, we have 38,000 people. Is it such a threat? Is it impossible to take 38,000 people without losing the Jewishness of the state, the demography of the state? And most of the people, especially politicians and or bureaucrats, they know that this is not a real threat. Especially when since 2012, since the completion of the fence that Nili presented in the movie, there are no newcomers. In the last year, I think we're talking about 2 people that entered. It's nothing. So with 38,000 people, for the last 5 years, no new entries. And at the same time, is it really a demographic threat? And the answer, sadly, is I think that, and by the way, talking about changing the policies and changing the assumptions towards asylum seekers, in the beginning, when people just started to come in 2006 and 2007, the majority of the people in Israel loved it. They felt, here is our chance to do better than other countries. When we tell other countries like Switzerland, you should have behaved differently, now we can prove them that we are behaving differently. And people would go to the army centers and bases and give food and blankets and then support the kids, and kibbutzim would take them to work with them so they will be released and so on. But the government decided to make a spin on this. And you saw some, like the one you saw screaming there, cancer in our body, is the culture minister in Israel. Another one became the justice minister, and so on and so on. And those guys actually used those asylum seekers and played a very, in my eyes, evil and dangerous game, because from one side, the government, which is usually in the right wing in Israel for the last years, never tried to deport people to Eritrea and Sudan because they know what happens in Eritrea and Sudan, and we should acknowledge that. Israel is not trying to send them to their death. There are countries who are doing it. At the same time, they didn't call them asylum seekers. They didn't call them refugees. They didn't start a mechanism to process the request and acknowledge who is a refugee as such. They kept calling them infiltrators and working migrants, and convincing the people that actually it's not the strong Israel that can support them, but it's the weak people of South Tel Aviv that are suffering from the burden of those infiltrators. So from one end, the state is not deporting them, and from the other end, not giving them rights and calling them infiltrators. And it convinced a lot of the people. If the justice minister is saying that they are not refugees, then they are not refugees.
I want to add something about the question of the attitudes, right? The origins of the attitudes and what we can do to change attitudes. As someone who moved to Israel, who made Aliyah over 6 years ago, one of the biggest challenges for me in dealing with this, approaching the situation, is understanding why so many Israelis feel the way that they do. Now, given there are many Israelis that have given so much to these people, but it doesn't seem to be the dominant attitude that you hear in the media or that the government is playing upon. I feel like the number one reason is fear. I think part of it is a demographic fear that is, as Asaf said, is no longer based in reality now that we have a fence. I think another is a basic, someone call it racism, I would call it xenophobia, a basic fear of the other. It's very easy for me as somebody who grew up in, suburban Chicago, who had friends who were different religions from me and different colors from me, right? I was used to that, and I had an entire education system, and my parents my whole life told me, love the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I think my peers who grew up in Israel grew up not having friends who were different colors and different religions from them, and an education system that told them, we're all Jewish, we're all the same, and that's a good thing. So I think undoing these built-in attitudes. I think the people who established the Jewish state envisioned a state based on Jewish values and culture, but I think over the last 70 years, that vision has gotten lost, and all that's kind of left is this shallow ethno-national definition of a Jewish state. The Bibi Netanyahu definition of a Jewish state, which is a state for Jews. And I think, like Asaf said, the government is playing upon these fears, both the demographic fears and the basic racial fears, to get more populistic votes. In terms of changing attitudes, I mean, the thing that I found most successful is when Israelis actually get to know these refugees and meet them face to face and realize these are human beings. That they actually, I mean, Bibi's the two things he says the most about this issue is, number one, he says, they're not refugees, they're not refugees. Well, it's very easy to say that, and it's much easier and convenient to believe that, because if you believe they're not refugees, then we have no moral obligation to them. If you admit that they might be refugees, then we have to actually deal with that and cope with that. But once you meet any one of these people face to face, or even see their stories on video, you realize these are refugees. And why are we trying to send them away? These are wonderful, amazing people who are contributing to our country. So I think just creating more opportunities for Israelis to meet these people. And I also think American Jews can have an influence. I think just like you were talking about the conversations that you're having with your Israeli family and peers, I think that for American Jews, when we talk about what Judaism is, it's tikkun olam and helping the stranger and helping the other. I think that has yet to be internalized in the Israeli mentality of this generation. And I think it's amazing, I think when Israeli Jews see that American Jews led the Save Darfur campaign, and American Jews are leading the fight for refugee rights in this country, I think the more conversations we can have with our Israeli peers to help them not fear, but appreciate what it means to be a Jewish state, that would be helpful.
And Asaf, did you want to talk about any success? I think you've had quite a high-profile success story. If you want to talk about that, or victories in general, or Elliot or Nili, if you want to jump in.
I just want to say something different. I want to say about what is happening with the women in the film, because nobody asked, and maybe if you will ask, I want to answer, because I think it's like saying what is happening with the women you just have seen. Natalina had to run away from Uganda. Now she's in Egypt for a few months already. In Uganda, she never worked one single day. In Egypt, she didn't work. She's there with her brother. He works. He has problems. His intelligence is like an 8-year-old kid. And only whatever he does, he can work, he can wash dishes. That's what he's doing for their living. The kids are in Uganda. The big daughter is in Israel. People fought very hard to enable her to study at the international school in Akfar Yarok. And that was a big success. It was very hard with the visa, but she finished her high school there. And now she's there to volunteer. She wants to be a doctor and help her people later on. So Natalina is in Egypt. She tried to contact me a few times, and we kind of didn't get to talk to each other. So she's still there with no work, and the situation is in the air. My son asked me one day, she's in Egypt, so she's going to make all this tour again, this route again, running from place to place to go back to Sudan and then Israel, and then, which is unfinished story. And Salem is in Israel, hoping she will go to the States, but the way it looks right now, it's a year ago that she is negotiating and talking to the embassy, having some people there that may be her sponsors, but so far it doesn't look, because nothing moved, so and she works in a health club, she takes care of the towels and so, and praying to go to another country, because as you've seen, she wanted to go to Uganda, which is terrible there. And nothing to do. They don't give work to anybody, any foreigners. About 1 million already arrived to Uganda just in the last 2-3 years, because they are running from the war in South Sudan. And they don't give, she told me then, they don't give the South Sudanese work because they don't have work themselves. So it's like a vicious circle. And so that's what happened with the women here. I wanted to mention it for you.
Thank you. Did you want to say a few words?
So it's a bit hard for me to mention the success we had really important cases in which we won in the Supreme Court, in other courts. It's hard for me to talk about it because of the situation now, because of the threat of detention and deportation to Uganda and Rwanda, because there are so many people we were not able to help. But at the same time, I acknowledge that by approaching to the courts, and especially to the Supreme Court eventually, we were able to release all the kids of the asylum seekers from detention. And we were able to strike down 3 times amendments to the anti-infiltration law. At the beginning, the Israeli parliament decided that all of the asylum seekers will be detained for 3 years, and the Supreme Court said no. So then they said, okay, they will be detained for 1 year, and then indefinite time in this open prison. And the Supreme Court again said no. And then the state said, okay, so 3 months detention, then 20 months in the open prison. And the Supreme Court said, okay, 3 months, and not 20, let's make it 12. And now they started new procedures to allow the ongoing detention in other mechanisms, in other laws, extra taxation on the work of asylum seekers and so on. And, you know, the case of Muatasem, one of the leaders of the community, Darfurian, I got his case in the beginning of 2014. He was recognized by the United Nations as a refugee, by the United Nations office in Israel. He was the only one who was recognized as a refugee because he came from Darfur, and because he was a political activist, and because he was detained and tortured by the Sudanese regime. And he came to Israel in 2009, and he was detained for 4 months, and he tried to ask asylum. Israel said, the government said, okay, come and ask asylum in 2 years. And then he waited 2 years and came again, and they said, extra 2 years. And eventually, during this time, they decided to send him to Cholot, to this closed detention facility, without even hearing him. And when I got this case, and this case was referred to me by the UN representative to Israel, I said, oh my God, this is the easiest case. They didn't even hear him. They sent him to indefinite detention. He's acknowledged as a refugee by the UN. Darfur, we all know what's going on in Darfur. Easy. And he was detained for a year and 4 months. And I had to go 6 times to courts in exactly the same petition, in the same appeal. 3 times I was in the Supreme Court. And each time they looked aside, they said, well, it's complicated, let's give it back to the Minister of Interior, let's send it back to the district court. I think most of the judges of the Supreme Court saw this case one way or the other for injunctions and appeals. And eventually we were able to release him, and it took another year, and he was recognized as a refugee, one of the only people in Israel that were recognized as refugees. And from one side, it's a huge success story. We have someone who is a refugee, who is traveling in the world and sharing his experience, who is a leader in his communities, who is studying law in Israel right now. But from the other side, 6 legal procedures, so much time when he is detained, all of this time. Why? And for how many people we can do such an illegal effort? And why the Supreme Court is not saying something clear about detaining or not detaining people from Sudan? Why the Supreme Court? I mean, Israel's Supreme Court is considered one of the best, an activist, a liberal, a strong, smart judges, you know. At the same time, the asylum system in Israel is known to be one of the worst in the world, yes, for sure in the Western world. Recognition rates of far less than 1%. Eritreans are recognized in Canada, let's say, 97% of the Eritreans are recognized as refugees. The recognition rates of Eritreans and Sudanese, especially from Darfur, like the majority of Sudanese in Israel are extremely high. In Israel, we're not talking even about 1%. How come this amazing Supreme Court exists and supervise such a poor asylum system and nobody makes the connection? So that's why it's difficult for me to speak about success, while at the same time I admit we had a few and significant ones. And one last thing, courts are important, and you have this in the States now as well. Courts are important, but courts can never be a final answer, because each time we got a good decision from the court, there was a backlash from the political forces, and the Supreme Court, in a way, got weaker. In Israel, I guess, you know, we don't have a constitution, for sure not as strong as in the States.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I want you to keep it short because I want to have time for some more questions.
Cool. So just to finish, the court's position is also unstable, and it also affects its decisions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, and thank you.
We have a question up
Couple
here,
more
and we could take a couple
questions.
more.
So I'm the founder of this film festival, and at the very beginning, this was 11 years ago, I said, no films about refugees. And this was my reasoning. First of all, there wasn't the wall, and they were streaming in. I said, look, what's happening in Africa is so horrific, and there are so many people, and they can just walk across the border, that Israel really can't deal with maybe millions of people who've been tortured, etc., that are going to come within their borders, not because they're not Jewish, but because this is an immigration that Israel can't deal with. Okay, so that's 11 years ago. They put up the wall, and I began to see that the people who are in Israel already must be treated humanely, and it is the obligation of Israel to be a humane country. And the people who are there already simply must be treated humanely. This was not a question. It was just try to give a picture of somebody who's older, who thought, well, you know, Israel doesn't have to take everybody in. And I have so changed my mind, because what Israel has to be is not to open its doors completely to everybody, but it must be humane.
All right, thank you for that comment. If we have a couple other people, let's have questions. Do 2 or 3 more.
Me? Okay. A couple of questions about the film itself, please. So one, I'm interested to know if it has played in Israel and what the reception has been. That's number one. And then 2, about the footage itself that you used in the movie. I want to know how much of it was original. Some of it, I don't want to say staged, but I wasn't sure if you were running along the border with these women. I want to know sort of where that footage came from. And then in connection with that, there was one clip in the movie I didn't really understand. The kids were watching. It looked like, frankly, anti-Semitic images of soccer playing. I
The
didn't,
Mondial, that's all, the song of the Mondial.
yeah,
They're
so I
watching
didn't
it in the-
understand this, and I was curious. So all about the film. Sorry, you guys. That's it. Thanks.
No, let's go ahead and, Nili, if you want to go ahead and answer those, because I do want to make sure we
we
do
start
talk about
with,
the film.
You're asking first about what you want to hear first.
Really, whatever's interesting to you, but did it show Israel? That was my first of the...
It was shown a few times already on Channel 1. They are partners of this production. And we got very strong reaction. People, one of the most heard reaction was that now we understand what it means to be a refugee. And people are very much moved by it. They try to, they offer their help to the shelter to help with the kids. The premiere was in the Israeli Cinematheque, and afterwards we had another screening. And people came to Rita with telephone numbers that were willing to help with money. That was really very moving. The film was already, it had the US premiere at DC on last February. And that was a very nice thing to be there. That was the DC International Film Festival in Washington. It was in Madrid on July, Madrid International Film Festival. It was in Ireland. It's called Ladies First International Film Festival, and there it got the best documentary. Thank you. And here, and we are beginning our sweating around to make it, to show it to as many people as we can, because I think the subject is, you don't see many women talk about themselves, about their feelings, about what they are going through in Africa. They're not being given the stage. Because of their culture, they're not used to expose the feelings or to be exposed in front of a camera. So that was something, that was one of the main reasons I wanted to make this film. Remind me your other question, please, sorry. Yeah, okay. Besides what you've seen from Sudan and Eritrea about the fightings, about the jail, that was what you've seen on a small screen, smaller, that was, we bought it from AP, from other archives. And I had from a friend some footage from Egypt. And Mustafa Mahmoud, when you see some photos, some stills, the photographer there gave me the opportunity to use the footage. He told me when he was taking photos, he sold it later on to the New York Times. He had to hide the chip of the camera on his shoe because they were forbidden to be there with cameras. So, and somehow I contacted him, I saw it, and I started to research who's the one behind those photos. that you said about anti-Semitism. About
Cartoon.
the cartoon, yeah, you asked about it. I'm surprised to hear it, but if you felt so, then I won't. It's a song of the Mondial. They made kind of a joke, a cartoon. It was during the Mondial, the international.
World Cup.
It's some cartoonist made it with a song, and it was like a joke. So they are practicing their Hebrew on the computer. So they playing with this song. They loved it. So suddenly I was talking to the mother. Suddenly I hear them singing. I said, "Oops, camera, let's see what they're doing." That was very strange to me too. But the Israeli made a cartoon about the Mondial. So it was a World Cup. Yeah, okay, that's.
It was like a parody about anti-Semitism against Israeli sports teams.
Like we always lose in the sports, and not anymore, because now we are very well in judo, as you heard lately. So we are strong physically.
All right,
Morally, we have to learn some more things, but that's later on. We'll learn.
very helpful context, because I also was a little shocked by that scene. Unfortunately, we do need to wrap up a little bit. So I just want to give each of you a chance if you want to say just very briefly something in closing, and particularly perhaps speak to this audience about what we can do right now, right here. Nili, do you want to start? Yes.
What can we do is, if we can help the children that you've seen in the film, that can be great. If there are anybody here that would like to, I can make the contact with Rita. You're not forced, but I say it because what we can do in the future. I think what can bring a change is looking at those people not as strangers. The more we know them and we face them and we talk to them, because you are afraid from the stranger. That's what Bibi's using, that's what everybody's using. When you don't know somebody, you think he's a monster, he's so different than you. But we're all going to sleep at night, we're getting up in the morning, we want to eat, we want to dream, we want to fulfill the dreams. So the more we talk to the people that we don't know, it's the same like with our neighbors in Israel, Jewish and Arabs. It's the closer you are, neighbors are getting along. The moment you know the person who is in front of you, you can get along easily. It's the leaders that are causing now putting the border between people. And the more you know the people, it will be easier to accept everybody, to leave some room to accept the other. But more than that, we have to keep fighting on the court with Asaf and his gang, and wish for more success in what they are doing.
Great. Asaf, did you want to add anything? What can we do? Or closing thoughts?
I think that the first step is to recognize that we should do something, and are willing to. And then, as individuals, we have different capacities. One is the resources, one is the connections, the political knowledge. The Jewish community in the States influenced Israel tremendously in so many ways. And it's about time that at least some of this influence will be also used to affect the situation of asylum seekers and refugees in Israel for the good. And there are people who are doing it. There are people who are investing a lot of money and time and efforts and political connections from here to change individual life and also the policies in Israel. And they're doing it. And there is a success, but we are very far from achieving what we deserve, what they deserve. And to start being proud at ourselves. And anything you can do to make us together, all of us, feel more proud and help them live in peace, in dignity, in Israel, would be blessed.
Thank you. Elliot?
I want to echo some of what Nili and Asaf said. I think it's important to do something. And I think it's important to understand this issue is so resolvable, right? It's not that complicated. We're talking about 38,000 people, right? Israel brings in tens of thousands of migrant workers from Asia every year. Israel could just give all of these people refugee status or temporary protection status or something tomorrow. And this issue, for the most part, would be resolved. It's politicians who choose not to and use divisive language to stoke the flames, right? Refugees aren't the issue in this case. It's turning them into an issue, right? The fear of the refugees is the issue. And like Asaf said, I think there are a lot of things that American Jews can do by investing monetarily in the organizations here and in Israel that are working on these issues, by raising this issue whenever we speak to Jewish leaders on this side of the ocean, whenever we speak to our peers and Jewish leaders on the other side of the ocean. I think the Israeli government feels they can do whatever they want because nobody will say anything about it. I mean, we've already had over 20,000 people who have been deported voluntarily from Israel, many of whom are no longer alive, including a few of my friends. So, it behooves us to say something, to let us not be silent, when the deportation of the Eritrean, the planned deportation of Eritrean comes. So speaking out, and I think the other thing is kind of trying to speak to the hearts of Israelis. I think just like the Prime Minister and politicians try to co-opt Jewish language to defend their policies, I think it's important for us as American Jews who are seen as friends and family by Israelis to fight fire with fire and help Israel redefine what it means to be a Jewish state for these 38,000 people, but also what it's going to look like for the next 70 years.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nili, for this beautiful and important film.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Itzi, for the festival, for everything.